Configuring the Cloud SDK on a compute engine instance. The second lab here in CP100 is a fun one. We're going to get into Compute Engine, spin up a Linux virtual machine, download and install the Google Cloud SDK, which will give us access to all of the command line tools. So the whole idea behind spinning up our own lab environment was so that we'd have a nice, consistent, standardized environment, one in which we know the labs will work on going forward for the rest of this course. Because when you start installing this stuff in your local environment, especially if you're in a corporate environment, you know that there's a lot of other factors that could affect having things work properly. You know, especially with things like firewalls out there and policies and just your local environment even can cause problems. But then came along Cloud Shell, which solves all of those problems because it's basically the command line built into the developer's console, and you always have the latest and greatest Cloud SDK ready to go. It's like a mini virtual machine, and it's free. So it's a really, really great tool. It's still technically in beta, but it's certainly going to be the way we do things going forward. Now, that doesn't mean you can't install the tools locally. In fact, I still love having them locally when I don't want to open up a browser or I don't have access to a browser. I can just whip up the command line and run some quick commands. So that's why I still think it's a good exercise to go through. So we're going to go through this exercise, and then I'm going to show you Cloud Shell as well. Let's do it. So first, let's get the lab doc open. Again, head over to content.gcptrain.org. Hit CP100 Google Cloud Platform Fundamentals, and this is the lab that we'll be working on in this nugget. The Module 4 lab, Configure a Compute Engine lab instance. I downloaded this stuff locally through the PDF media, and here it is. So if you try this out on your own, read through the overview there. It should take you roughly 30 minutes to do. All you need is a Google Cloud project and a project ID. We have that from previous nuggets in the previous lab. What we're going to do is create a Linux-based compute engine virtual machine, and then we're going to configure the Cloud SDK on it. And then we'll walk through some of the G Cloud utilities too. I'll show you how to get it set up, and we'll do the same thing in Cloud Shell. So we're going to start right here with create a compute engine instance. I'm going to run through steps 1 to about 15 with you, which is going to be spinning up our compute engine virtual machine. So we're going to call this virtual machine CP100-labs. We're going to choose the zone nearest you. We're going to choose a G1 small machine type. A machine type is your physical specification of the machine, so memory and CPU. We're going to create a 20 gigabyte boot disk, put the latest version of Debian Linux Wheezy on it, and then that should get us right down to about the point where we're going to SSH in. We'll SSH in, and then we'll stop here, and I'll show you a couple of things before we start executing commands to download and install the Google Cloud SDK. So that's step number 1. Let's head over to the Cloud Console. console.cloud.google.com. Make sure you are under your CP100 project that we created in our first lab, and let's head down to Compute Engine. Once we're in Compute Engine, we're going to create an instance. And since we've never been in here, we can use the little start message here that says, hey, you want to create an instance? Yeah, we sure do. Let's do it. So let's hit create an instance, and we're going to give this one the name CP100-labs. Choose a zone closest to you. I'm on the East Coast, so I'm going to go ahead and choose US East 1B. Machine type, again, physical spec of the machine here. What you want to do is head up to the top and choose, let's choose the small one here. This is the small one that it wants us to choose in the lab. Nice small machine, 1.7 gigs of memory, and one shared virtual CPU. So we don't need much more. We're just executing commands against our resources in the cloud, so we don't really need that big of a machine here. And then down here for our boot disk, we want to hit change, and we are going to choose the latest Debian GNU Linux 7.9 Wheezy image. Down here we want to change our size of our disk here to 20 gigabytes. So we're going to use a standard persistent disk here for this, and then hit select. All right, and that's it. We're good to go. So now all we need to do is hit the create button, and that's going to spin up that instance. Keep an eye up here on your notifications. This will be, when this is finished spinning, it should be done. But when it is done, and you can also see it down here, we'll be able to SSH into the machine. And it's up. That took about 30 seconds. Definitely one of Google's strengths is performance. Their machines spin up faster than any other cloud out there. So now the next thing we can do is SSH into it and start running some of the commands. But before we do that, I want to show you something kind of neat here. I'm going to go back to our training site here, content.gcptrain.org, and we'll go right into CP100 here. And notice this first link inside of the lab docs here, lab command reference file. This is really, don't copy and paste them from the lab doc itself because it won't work. There's a lot of special characters in there, and you'll definitely come across a lot of problems. So if you want to copy and paste commands, use this command reference file. So here it is, lab 4, create a compute engine lab machine. Here are all the commands we are going to run. So even though, copying and pasting, isn't a great way to learn, definitely if you want to learn this stuff, type it all out because it's a great learning experience and it'll start getting this stuff into your muscle memory. But this is definitely here if you need it. So this is what I'm going to do so you don't have to watch me type. I'll just copy and paste these commands into here and explain what they're doing. But I just wanted to point that out. The command reference file, definitely awesome. You'll see that with all of our Google courses. Now, let's head back to the console. Let's hit SSH. Let's get right in to this machine through the browser. And the first command we're going to execute here is just to update the local repository of packages. So I'm going to paste that command in here. There it is, sudo apt-get QQ update, meaning it's going to go in quiet mode here, and that's going to go and update the local repository here. The next thing we're going to do then is install Git, because we're going to actually download the SDK through a GitHub repository. So I'm going to paste this in here, sudo apt-get install, yes, quiet mode, make Git. So that'll install Git and get us up and running for that, and then we'll clone the repository locally, which will give us the Cloud SDK. All right, so that's good. Let's go ahead and clone that Git repository locally. Next up, we're going to run the make file to update the Cloud SDK. So what that make file did was upgrade our local repository SDK, which by the way was 93.0.0, Cloud SDK version that we cloned from that Git repository, to 96.0.0. And it did so by doing a gcloud components update. So if you're going to install this stuff on your own machine, you will have to run this periodically to get the latest version. It'll tell you too, anytime you launch it and you have a different version, it'll let you know that you need to do an update. But a gcloud components update will go and it'll update all of the utilities inside of the SDK. So you can see we got BigQuery upgraded, the Cloud SDK core libraries updated, beta commands were upgraded, kube control is updated, which is Kubernetes, and now we're on the latest version. The final command we're going to execute here, we're going to source this file. So all the commands in this file will get executed, and it's essentially just going to modify our path environment variable for our current shell. And that's it. Now we're ready to configure the Cloud SDK. So let's start with the gcloud config list. This will show us all of the properties that are currently configured for the SDK. You can see the account we're currently using for authentication is a service account, and we have the right project. And the service account is actually recommended when you're doing things like this on a shared virtual machine. We're actually going to switch this to our personal account. So to do that, we're going to do a gcloud auth login, and we could say no launch browser here, and it'll just copy the URL right here into the command line so we can copy it and do it all by hand. So it even gives you that message here. You're running on a GC VM and it's recommended that you use service accounts for authentication. We'll talk more about service accounts when we get into our nugget on projects. But we're going to go ahead and say yes here. We want to do that. And here it's going to give us this URL to copy into our browser to complete the authentication process. It'll then spit back code that we'll paste in here, and we'll be able to switch accounts. So I'm going to open up a browser here. I'm going to paste that URL right into here. It's going to have me walk through the authentication process. Look at this, OAuth 2. And it's saying the Google Cloud SDK would like to do all of this stuff. And we'll say, yep, sure, we'll allow it. Here is that code. So I'm just going to copy that onto the clipboard. And now I can go right back here and we can paste that in here, hit enter, and boom. We are now logged in as myself. And we can re-verify that with the gcloud config list. And we can see now we are no longer running under a service account. Now, just a couple of tips here. If you have multiple Google accounts and multiple projects under those accounts, you can first you'll need to authenticate with each one of those accounts, and then you can do a gcloud config set account, and you can specify your account. And that'll switch you between accounts. And the same thing here with projects. If you need to flip between projects, gcloud config set project, pass in your project ID, and that'll switch you to that project. Also, if you want to see all your authenticated accounts, you can do a gcloud auth list, and that'll list the accounts. And you can see we have that service account in here, and then our account we just logged in under is the currently active account. Now the next thing we're going to do is set up some defaults here. So let's do a gcloud compute for compute engine regions list. Setting up your default region and zone in compute engine will save you a lot of typing down the road, because most of the commands that you execute you will need to specify a region and a zone. So by doing this, it'll automatically fill them in for you, and you can of course still override them by specifying those flags explicitly. So to set up a default here, we're going to do a gcloud config set compute / region and specify a region. I'm going to do US East 1 for the region. And then we're going to do the same thing for zone. So we'll just turn this into a zone. And remember, the zone name also includes the region name. So US East 1 dash and then your zone. And I'm going to do B here. And there you go. Now if you do a gcloud config list, we should also see those in our configuration properties. They're there, region and zone for compute. So now we have the SDK ready to go. We can do things like this: gcloud compute instances list, and we should see the instance that we're currently on right here running. There's the internal IP, there's the external IP, there's the name, there's the zone, and there's the machine type we chose. So we can easily work with all of our resources here through the command line. Now, another thing I should mention is we just kind of went the long way in doing all of that, because the recommended way of doing what we just did is running a gcloud init that will actually walk through all of those. It'll authenticate you. It will ask you for your default region and zone, ask you for your default project. It'll take you through all the steps that we just did line by line. So remember that if you do need to install or configure a freshly installed Cloud SDK, just run a gcloud init. And then, of course, due to Cloud Shell, all of that is completely optional, because watch this. I'm going to go ahead and close out of this. I'm just going to do an exit here. But let's go back into Developers Console and click on this button of Win up here, which will activate Google Cloud Shell. So read through this. It comes pre-installed with all the tools you need for the Google Cloud Platform. Start Cloud Shell. Look at this. How cool is this? It's going to fire it up down here. You can move it around. You can add more instances, and each one of these is going to be running on its own little VM. So really, really cool. And it's got all the tools we need. So we really don't have to do much but fire up Cloud Shell, and we can start ripping off commands and doing a lot of the things you can do from your local command line right here inside of the browser. All right, it's ready to go. Ready? gcloud compute instances list. There's our instance. gcloud compute regions list. There's our regions. We didn't even have to install anything. It just automatically works. How cool is that? And then, of course, we could do a gcloud config list, and we can see that we are running under this. And we can still set up defaults and all that in here as well. Now, one thing I want to show you here before we go is if you need to get any help, and I'm going to give you the link to the documentation because it's awesome. It's very well laid out, very easy to learn all of these gcloud commands. But if you just do gcloud, it'll list all of the top level commands underneath gcloud. So here's all the things you can do. Here's where we were just in: gcloud compute, gcloud beta, gcloud alpha, gcloud components, gcloud preview, gcloud SQL for working with Cloud SQL, container for working with Container Engine, and then you have some other commands out here as well. And then you can get subcommands, so we can do gcloud compute and just hit enter, and it'll give us all of the things we can do inside of compute. So here's your command groups within there for working with disks and firewalls and addresses, and all things we'll touch on when we get into Compute Engine. But Cloud Shell, certainly an incredible addition here to the Google Cloud Platform, because it's going to make all of our lives easier when working with the command line. And when you're done, just close out of it. It's as easy as that. Now, to finish this nugget, don't forget to shut down your lab machine if you did this on your own. And you can do it a number of ways. You could fire up Cloud Shell and do a gcloud compute instances stop, pass in the name to your instance, or you can do it in the UI here. Just click on check it here and then hit the stop button up here. You could also go into the instance details here, and you can do it right on the specific instance, but make sure that you stop it so it's not chewing up your credits. In the CPT Nugget, we walked through the second lab in CP100, installing and configuring the Cloud SDK on a Linux Compute Engine virtual machine. We spun up a virtual machine, downloaded, installed, and configured the Cloud SDK, and even used the gcloud utility a little bit there. And then we saw that that's pretty much optional these days because of Cloud Shell. Cloud Shell has the latest and greatest SDK installed and ready, and it's easily accessible right there inside of the Developers Console. Certainly the way that most of us will be doing things here in the future. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.